Ambassador, thanks for talking to the EU Asia Centre. You've had President Barroso and Cathy Ashton visiting Australia recently, so how would you describe the state of EU-Australia relations?
The relationship between the European Union and Australia is in transformation. Australia has, in part I suppose, historically been a Eurosceptic country, fed largely by British media and being deeply scarred by Britain's entry into the common market in the early 1970s. We had invested heavily in a peaceful Europe through 2 world wars, with 70,000 Australians dying in Europe. But for us, we'd always had respect for the European Union, but our political class had not engaged actively. We've made a very conscious decision in the last 3 years to take this relationship to an entirely new level, a so-called Tier 1 relationship alongside that of the other G20 countries. From Australia's perspective, it's extremely important as the world changes very quickly and the patterns of economic and political power have shifted over the last decade, accelerated by the financial crisis, that as much as possible we have a coherent Europe and one which is actively engaged with Australia and also has an understanding and engagement in the Asia Pacific.
Now you're negotiating, I understand, a framework agreement with the EU. What would be in that agreement?
Well, we made the decision, in fact I had a discussion with Stephen Smith, who was our Foreign Minister early last year, and said to him, look, we have to cross a threshold here, we have to make a decision about whether we want to take the relationship to a higher level, and that's what the government is doing. So we are now negotiating a treaty, capital T, framework agreement, having now a mandate from the European Council. We would expect that it will take about a year before it's fully concluded and signed. But what that will do is put a legal architecture around the relationship between Australia and the European Union. It means that there will be responsibilities both on the EU and on Australia for engagement at the most senior political level and also at an officials level. And that will mean that there are 5 broad areas in which we will focus: foreign affairs and security, trade and economic issues, overseas development assistance. We've already negotiated a delegated cooperation agreement, for example, on development assistance, environment and climate change, and then research and education. So what that will mean from Australia's perspective, pragmatic and flexible arrangements, but a regular dialogue between the Prime Minister of Australia and the President of the European Council, the President of the European Union, commissioners and ministers, and then officials. But we're not after summits, we're not after some arrangement where the most senior people in the EU go to Canberra 1 year and then we come to Brussels. We're Australians, we're not like that. But we do want to see that we get some outcomes which serve the interests of the liberal democracies represented by the EU and of course our own country Australia, and not just economic and trade and other benefits which are already significant in the relationship, but also to see that we're able to work together on foreign policy in the interests of the values that inform both of our
And looking
countries.
at the wider region, do you think the EU should be upping its relationship with Asia as a whole, Asia Pacific?
Well, the world, as I said, has changed so significantly, even in the last 5 years. And the Asia Pacific is now more than half the world's population. The World Bank thinks that by 2030 we will be about 40% of global economic output. The region is stable, but it's potentially very unstable. There are deep strategic uncertainties in the region, and one of the things that's very important is the architecture of the region. The ASEAN group of countries, the ASEAN Regional Forum, and the various permutations around the ASEAN Plus arrangements. It's important for us that we have an architecture which is understood and actively supported, not only by the United States, but also by the values and soft power and economic strength of the European Union. And in Europe, seeking to deepen its engagement, for example, with China and with India, a part of our messaging to the Europeans is to understand the importance of the countries of East Asia, not just Japan, of course, but also Indonesia, Malaysia, Australia, and our place in the region. And So that's part of the messaging that we give, along with others, of course, to the Europeans, and we found them most receptive to it.
Ambassador, thank you for talking to the EU Asia Centre.
Always my pleasure.